Well, thank you very much for having me today. That was a really good introduction to this talk, because I've got a few things to talk about today. But I'll first introduce myself. When I'm not at Seek, I like climbing things. So if you don't see me hacking and defending web applications, then I'm normally climbing things like that. Twitter and my website. I've linked off to a few things today because it's kind of a reflections talk on the last 4 years of all these different things we've been working on, and also what didn't go so well. So I can't cover it all, so I've done some links to some blogs I've written recently about some of the topics. I run the local OWASP chapter, which is OWASP Foundation, for those of you who don't know, is kind of focused around application security. It's a non-for-profit out of the US, and they've got branches all the way around the world. It's mostly volunteer run. And I volunteer for the Melbourne chapter and have for quite a few years. And then we also run a one-day conference towards the end of this year for DevSecOps / software security / anything that a developer has to care about when we kind of do this whole shift left thing. So many buzzwords in one sentence there, that was pretty good. So feel free to come along and or sponsor that one. So today we're going to be talking about DevSec QA FinOps, I believe is the right term. So, and also Seek commissioned a survey, as well as, no, just joking. So actually that was a really good introduction, because I actually used quite a few quotes from the security chapter within this book. I read it quite recently and it kind of blew my mind, so +1 for this one. I just wanted to mention that as well. So we'll get straight into it. There's going to be a lot of memes. It's the end of the day. I'm going to try and keep this pretty entertaining. If you have questions, I'm going to ask a few questions as well. I might do a tiny bit of survey, actually, before we answer this question. But how many of you write code during the year? Awesome. I'm assuming you commit that to a Git repository, because that's one of the first things. Awesome. So this talk, we'll get into a little bit of technical stuff. Not too much, though, so I think most people will be able to understand the general concepts. There is a lot more detail in those blog posts that I mentioned. And I've got a lot of content to cover, so I'm going to go pretty quickly. So don't get worried too much about missing anything, and I'll make these slides available afterwards as well. So I guess my question is, in the last 6 months, who has felt like this? I know I have. I work in the security team, and I know there's a few quotes in here around what was mentioned in the last talk as well. I try not to be that person. I guess some of the reasons for that have been discussed today, but we did like a bit of a census around Seek of how many languages and frameworks and things we use. And this is a good 3 years ago, right? So this has changed pretty dramatically in that time period, as well as we've grown organically. We have a lot. So there's, from a security perspective, not even to mention what a developer has to consider, there is a lot to consider. So back in 2014, or even sometimes today, depending on your company, this was the typical context of a developer's workflow, right? So there's only a small amount of things. You're normally writing code, you develop it, then there's that kind of nice infographic of the dots from Google I've mentioned a few times today, where you kind of shift it over the wall. This has turned into something a little bit more sophisticated now, where more of the stack is getting controlled by a smaller team, which is great, right? So we're talking about that today, getting more ownership and accountability for the whole stack and the whole product within the same team. But that does mean that there's more to worry about, more to learn, and that learning curve is pretty steep, especially when you start considering you have to add security into the mix as well. So you have a bunch of developers and they're kind of just like, oh, what do we do? Especially adding security in. So they're already kind of gasping for air. And then you get an email from the security team being like, dear developers, 2019 called and said security is everyone's job. So here's a report of 2,000 unvalidated issues for you to fix. So no wonder you have things like, yeah, okay, thanks, bye. I don't know how people sign off, but then there's no wonder that the team comes around and says, screw you in your report. I'm not touching any of these because most of them are invalid and false positives. So that's kind of on the fault of the security industry a little bit, but it's also a lack of knowledge and education. So another survey that I'm referencing today is the DevSecOps community survey, and a similar sentiment is in the Accelerate book as well, that security is definitely believed to be a blocker or an inhibitor to moving quickly in a safe way. But then we have this. So this is a graph or a very cool representation of the number of breaches that happen, mainly the bigger ones, right? It's pretty hard to keep up with everything that happens these days. But you can see there's quite a lot of big breaches. Equifax was a really big one that hit the news a year or so ago. Yahoo, that's just one dot. They had 3 big breaches. So there's a lot of things happening. So companies really need to start working out how to secure their products so this kind of thing doesn't happen. This is a dynamic graph too, so you actually go to this website, it's really cool, and filter down. So who can tell me what this graph represents? It's very sophisticated. It came from a very reputable source. So basically, this is reiterating the concept of if you're making security too hard, people are going to go around it. So you might say more security controls should equal less data breaches. But in reality, it actually is the reverse. So you make security too hard for a team to integrate with, and they end up just bypassing it completely, and then you have no risk reduction. And you get things like this. So you have to make security controls easy to adapt. This is basically someone getting really annoyed about using their key pass to go in and out of a door, so they just kind of found a way around it. So developer happiness, we talk about a lot at Seek to try and break down those silos that Nathan was talking a bit about, where no one in the development teams know the security team. It's a big kind of conflict relationship. We don't have as big of an issue because we've done a lot of work around awareness and education and support. But in the earlier days, that was definitely the case. But everything we do has to kind of adhere to some of these basic principles. Otherwise, you can think of your customers like the product teams, like your SRE teams, exactly the same as what was talked about this morning. Having your service level objectives, where you kind of, as a security team, you adhere to that level of service. If you're pushing a product and it breaks and the devs need you to fix it because you're the only one managing that service, you need to be responsive. If you're lucky enough to have a company with a security team, I think most people here would have something like that. So now we're going to go on a journey back in time. I'm glad I'm not the only one who used the Back to the Future reference today. So we're going to go all the way back to 2014 and see what Seek was like. Oh, actually, maybe not that far. That's 2002, actually, so that's a little bit too far. Let's try that again. Okay, so 2014, we did hire some good UI, user experience designers, which is good. But the Seek looked very different back then. So back then, it was like less than 70 devs, one office building, simple software stack like .NET Shop, IIS, all that kind of stuff. A physical data center, very few Git repositories, or almost like monolith-based applications, that kind of thing. And very few deploys per day. But still up there, right? So it's definitely not the 6-month cycles that you were talking about. But now we move to a much, much larger organization. And the interesting thing, some of this happened because of acquisition, but a lot of it actually just happened organically. And a lot of the business, what I've noticed, just didn't realize how big it had got. I think it just, when you change as a person, you don't notice that you're getting older because it happens so slowly. A very similar thing happens here. And it's becoming more and more evident that the processes and the procedures and the way we worked back then, which we still have some of those things, just isn't cutting it anymore. And some of that is like, the lack of documentation, the lack of processes around how things change between teams, into collaboration between the whole, all the different teams and things like that. So the other thing that's changed, I guess, not so much, but we have quite a lot of personal data. A lot of people think we just store LinkedIn, publicly available CVs. But we do have a lot of CVs that we store. If people don't know who Seek is, I should mention that. We're a jobs website, help people find fulfilling and working lives, something like that. Yeah, so people put things like their passport photos uploaded into the Word document, driver's license, because they're a bus driver or something and they want as much of a possibility of showing that they can drive a bus. Bank account information, so they can be super prepared when they finally get paid. Things like that, right? So and even like culture differences, we've seen a lot of people putting health information like blood type and things in there because certain cultures expect that in there. Lots of physical addresses of where people live, age, you name it. And also more recently, we've started a bit of a startup called Certsy, and they now store 100 points of ID, so we have massive amounts of critical data around people's identities, basically. So that's changed things a little bit for us too. So now I think we're just going to kind of, this morning was like, there's something about the fire brigade and they see these fires every time. I feel like if they saw that, they'd probably get scared, even though they've been doing this day to day. So instead of shifting left, we shifted right. So what I mean by that is, instead of integrating security more closely with the development team, this is back in the day, I'm still in Back to the Future, or Back to the Past, I don't know. So we actually left it up to our customers to tell us when we had security issues. So that's as far right as you can possibly get, in my opinion. So obviously not a massive issue, it's just SSL Labs score, looks kind of bad, but it's really just saying we've got some outdated protocols. However, this guy, or girl, is pretty serious. You can tell by his pinned tweet, his or her pinned tweet, sorry, and how many followers. So we kind of got on this pretty quickly. Within about 24 hours or less, we were able to get it back up to an A, which is awesome. And then a few days later, again, it's like, oh, here we go. What have we started? We don't use SSL, so it was that whole thing where the login page was secure, but then you jump into the logged in section, it would put you to a HTTP site. Kind of embarrassing, to be honest. That took us about 6 months. So there was a lot of legacy behind that project. We spent way too long trying to get that to happen. And then finally, we were able to put secure flag on all the cookies and do all that kind of stuff, which is what we needed to. These aren't Seek employees, by the way. They seem a little bit too overly happy. So now our SSL Labs score is decent. I do want to put a caveat here that a lot of people in the security industry do talk about transport layer security quite heavily. It's because it's the easiest thing to measure. It's actually not the most riskiest thing that you can worry about. So fixing stuff like this is more of a public perception thing than a security risk, given the likelihood of actually attacking that kind of thing. Different if you're maybe in the Google sphere of things. But for us, that kind of risk is minimum. So that was a little bit too far to the right. So what can we do that's a little bit closer to the left? So what about just random internet people that are just going to hack our stuff? Maybe, that could work, right? Does everyone know who these people are? Okay, good. Some people haven't seen it. Hackers, for those of you who haven't. It's a terrible movie, but it's hilarious. I love it, it's great. So there's this website called Open Bug Bounty, and you can actually put in your website and see if anyone submitted any, or disclosed publicly any vulnerabilities on your domains. And we actually found out about a few cross-site scripting issues that happened to us back in the day by this researcher who, no idea where they're from, on our main site with a very simple XSS attack. So that was pretty embarrassing. It was publicly disclosed, so they didn't even tell us about it. They just said, here's the exploit, so anyone on the internet could then use that. So we kind of scrambled to fix this issue, and it was a very simple, embarrassing alert. That's basically the most basic cross-site scripting attack you can perform. So we didn't want this to happen, right? So we don't want Seek to be in the media like all those other companies have been on that other slide. So Seek definitely doesn't want to be like, oh, what do? We don't want the media as our kind of incident response alerting either. So we emailed this person and we said, hey, Dimitri, if you find vulnerabilities in the future, please disclose them via our security email. Unfortunately, as you publicly disclose the issue, we can't pay you, basically. So he was a little bit like sad face. But then very quickly, probably like within a month or so, they basically reported 3 or 4 extra vulnerabilities on our website directly to us through that email address. So that kind of like was a bit of an aha moment for us as far as like, how do we do this but in like a more official way? Because this is like pretty dodgy, like an email address, and then we'd be like paying, you know, $550 via a PayPal account we set off from the head of engineering's like credit card, and you know, it wasn't great. But as soon as we said this email, he was like, boo! And then 10 minutes later, sent the PayPal email address for us to pay. So that kind of triggered something for us, and we then went along to do our vulnerability disclosure policy, where we tell the researchers around the world that they're allowed to break into our systems, not break in, but find and discover vulnerabilities, and stop before the breaking. So that was kind of part one. And then over the last 3 years, we've also had a private and now a public bug bounty program, where we've had a pretty successful program as far as awareness to developer teams, because that was part of the benefit for us. A total of 115,000. Highest payout more recently last year was 10,000 for one bug that was pretty embarrassing. It was like legacy again. We had this old school system that got deprecated, and then we had a party, there was cake, and then about 2 years later, this researcher found that the endpoints were still existing publicly, found an exploit, and yeah, it went from there. So not great. Just because you have a party still means you have to turn off your things. So I'm not going to go any more into the bug bounty program. I cover it very thoroughly in that blog post. It's pretty long, so. But that's kind of a guide to setting up bug bounty program and how we kind of went from start to finish there. Again, these are all on Medium, so if you just grab that URL, you can see them all there. The other part of it is just-in-time security education, because no one wants to read like documentation on like cross-site scripting or like all these different things that you have to consider. It's more important if we can give the teams the information they need exactly when they need it, as early as possible. And that's kind of, in my opinion, the definition of shifting left a little bit. So you're shifting the feedback cycle of identifying vulnerabilities earlier and earlier, so that you can get it fixed before it gets too far. And this is where we get to that whole nagging thing where it's like, hey, can you fix this issue? 54% of technology teams see security as like in the role of nag. I understand that completely, because it is kind of, especially if you're not providing them with relevant information and you're not describing the risks associated. And they've got thousands of other things going on in their day-to-day. We solve this in a few ways, but I won't go too much into the cultural aspects of how we solve that. Again, there's a blog post about that one. So the just-in-time education piece is actually more around the clear guidance of the why. So why do I need to fix this issue? Like, how important is it? What is it accessing? A good example of this the other day, someone wanted to add a GitHub integration that was like Git cracking or some other UI-based Git integration. And I just asked a simple question. I said, what permissions does it need? And then he kind of sent a screenshot of what it needed, and it was like full access to all repositories on our Seek Jobs org. And I was like, so that means, all I had to say was, so that means that they can access every single one of our 2,000 plus repos. And then he was like, oh, when you say it like that, that makes sense. It was just like, didn't really consider that, because their domain of scope is their one repo that they want that integration for, but it's going to apply to all repos on Seek. So things like that, relevant, and also where to get help. So that's the ad hoc training section, which is what I'm really focused on here. We do some other training sessions during the tech induction when people join the company. That's like a 2-hour session, a full day training course, which we run once or twice a year. And then we've recently started a Security Champions program where it's like CTF-based challenges for developers who are really interested. So it's kind of a volunteer-based system. We don't force it. It's just like whoever comes, and we actually use that as a great recruiting tool into our team because we find developers and that kind of technical background is actually quite good to get into security and application security. And that's another blog post covering exactly that kind of full-day course structure. The other just-in-time related to the bug bounty program is everything's going into our chat platform. We're using Slack. And you can see here, someone's left a note in our security team, Pamela. She's created a Jira ticket for that issue, which explains the likelihood, impact, all that kind of relevant information, how to remediate it in an easy way. And then also you can see things like how much has been paid out. So it gives the teams a sense of how big this issue was versus other issues which aren't as big. So it helps us from a priority perspective as well. Yeah, so that's an example of what the Jira ticket looks like. It can be any kind of system. And the important thing here is ownership, which was spoken about earlier today as well. Getting that ownership right and accountability to fix these issues is pretty important. The other thing we do is, and again, this is kind of, I really struggle with this one because we're definitely not trying to shame anyone, and that kind of blameless culture definitely holds true within Seek from our production issues like incidents and reliability concerns. One thing we did is we did integrate security issues into the incident response process. It just wasn't considered an incident. So we went through the same exact process of postmortems, like triaging the issue, getting the teams involved. And this is an example of a channel that has quite a lot of people in it, as you can see. So it's it's kind of like the most looked at channel on Slack. Because if something gets posted here, it means something's down, basically. So we decided last year to start posting security issues through the bug bounty program in other ways, through pen tests and all that kind of stuff, into this channel, but in a blameless way as much as possible. So we don't name anyone. We name some of the teams sometimes because that's like unavoidable. We link off to how to learn more about it. So it's like that kind of just-in-time awareness. It's relevant to most teams because it's affecting us. So it's the best form of education. And then people start replying, and this is one of our developers who's really awesome. He's come through the Security Champions program a bit and also got involved in a lot of our auth-related projects. And that's an example of like defense in depth. So we changed the scoping of one of our cookies that was like an auth cookie. And now this particular issue wouldn't have been affected by a lot more customers. So the attack surface, as we like to say, has been reduced significantly. So those are kind of cool things to notice, and other people then get used to like contributing to these kind of things. I won't go too much into this, but again, it's kind of like a similar post-mortem process where instead of going through what the root cause of the reliability incident, it's what's the root cause of the security incident, and asking the same questions like your 5 whys or whatever you come up with, as well as your things like your high fives, what went well, who fixed it really quickly. So we do really encourage the devs that like get onto it straight away. And we've been running that for about a year or so now. It's been really successful. And I had a bit of a moment the other day when I started looking into this issue that came through that bug bounty alerts channel. I was like halfway through, it was like an hour in to like replicating it and then writing that Jira ticket and doing that process. And then I was about to go reach out to the team that was affected by that particular issue to try and get them to start fixing it pretty quickly because it was severe. And I realized that they'd already fixed it. So before I even could triage it, they saw something in the GitHub, the bug bounty alerts channel, or someone posted it into their team saying we should get onto this, and it was already fixed by the time I reached the team. So that's a testament to that kind of continuous delivery conversation, which is what Nathan was talking about, and also the education and making things a bit more publicly accessible so that you get that kind of collaboration. And security is not kept in the dark all the time. So it looks like something like this. The other thing we did, which is kind of more from that scaling problem I was talking about. So in the old days, it was like, I'd just go up to a team and say, hey, you need to think about these things from a security perspective. We used to have meetings with each team monthly when we had like 7. Now we have 30, 40 plus teams. You can't really scale that kind of awareness. So there's a really, so 300 developers trying to do individual meetings and give guidance to every single person. Normally, when you have the ratio of 1 to 100, 1 to 200 developers to security people, that gets quite difficult. This is a really cool talk at AWS reInvent. I think it was either last year or the year before by Riot Games. And they introduced this concept of an RFC process, which obviously that process in itself is not new. It's obviously the standard process used for internet standards. But they adapted that, not as an approval process, but as a collaboration and alignment process. So we kind of stole that a little bit, turned it into, they were using Confluence. We started using Git repository. So we have this concept of if you want to enact a standard or a design pattern within Seek, most teams will just do what they need to do, but if it's going to affect the Seek-wide, like auth protocols or source control, you put this document out that it's for review, right? So it's requests for comments and feedback. So then you can start adding reviewers and getting their feedback on the PR. It's all in the open. You have meetings about it as well if you need to, if it's a complex topic. So you get wide scale, scalable alignment on design patterns, and that helps us from a security perspective, obviously, because then we can start adding security-related concerns in these documents as well. So this is the source code repository where it's your typical RFC format. You have some owners, and they're not the people who, so anyone can contribute to these and put PRs to them, but the scope then indicates who's basically accountable for this particular implementing the things in this RFC. So we've got 20 or so at the moment, right? So that's happened over a year or so. We've built up these RFCs. They're quite long and they're very bland. It's even I would fall asleep trying to read through all these. So that's where it's kind of that triangle of policies, standards, and procedures, that kind of thing, where these are more like your policies or your standards, but then you need to build those common tools like what we'll discuss today as well, so that people get that just-in-time awareness of when they're not fulfilling some of the things within these RFCs. So this is something that's another channel where something's been created as public, and we say definitely no public repos on our GitHub org, because obviously then everyone in the world can see it. We have a separate org for our open source projects. So we have a rule around that. They get added directly in the channel, so we don't have to maintain that. Same thing with a lot of other different alerts, right? So you can see that it's very dynamic, just in time. They get DM'd as well, because no one reads email at Seek, so I have to use the tools where people are. And this is kind of a segue into the secure by default. So that's if you have that common tooling, like what was talked about today, it's much easier, and everyone's starting to adopt this kind of paved road or paved path model, whatever you want to call it. Then you can start, with a very little effort, adding security into these common tools instead of needing to add security and help and advise teams across the board, where the security expertise is a little bit hard to scale. And it's a lot better if you have a developer experience team or the build team that are capable of building these common tools, and you have a really good relationship with them, and doing things like having standard AMIs that have all the security configuration by default that actually works, rather than building in SE Linux and taking everything away, and then you're yeah, please use this AMI, and then nothing works on it. So it's obviously you still need to consider the developer happiness and the operational considerations. So we did that with a few different things. We have now at least develop and build, where we can start adding some scans into the different phases of the lifecycle. Before that, we couldn't even, there was no central place to know when a commit happened, for example, because there was a few teams using different Git repositories. We didn't have a really easy way of knowing when someone committed some code. Same thing with the build environment, which I'll go into in a second. So having these gates, as we like to call them, they're not blocking gates. They're more like a checkpoint where a team, it could be security, it could be that developer experience team, can hook in to whatever's going on there in a parallel path, and then add things to it and alert off that. So you can get really good metrics on your security maturity, and then over time you can build things to drop that instead of blocking from the start and So another quote from this book, 50% high-performing teams, which is what was defined before with all those different stats, 50% of those high-performing teams spend less time fixing issues. And I won't go too much into that because that was already covered a little bit in the last talk. But this is kind of really good evidence to say if you can do really solid engineering, adding security into that environment is a lot easier and there's a lot less effort involved than starting from scratch where you don't have that kind of environment. So that's what we pitch a lot of the time. We help the architecture team quite heavily and the developer experience team get some projects over the line by saying we can work together, and then both people are happy. So we replaced our build system recently as well. Went to Buildcar, which is a really cool Australian-based company. Our old build system was a little bit fragile, and it had been for quite a few years. No one wanted to use it. There wasn't like pipelines as code, all these new concepts that allow really awesome automation throughout that process. And we were able to add secure by default things within this journey. So we were there from the ground, day zero when they were starting that project, and it was kind of inspirational to problem solve with the engineers to make a system that not only was so much better from a developer experience perspective, but it catered for so many different security requirements that we had. And we didn't really have to sacrifice too much. And we ended up actually going almost with a zero trust model with Buildcar because they're a service. But we actually had a zero trust model because we had the agents were deployed on our infrastructure and things like that, and we had some kind of, not encryption, but basically like we could verify that what was sent to their server came back and what was getting deployed in production was the same thing, code-wise. So that was actually a really cool experience, at least from my perspective, to know that some of this stuff is actually possible, because everyone talks about shifting left and integrating more security by default. It did rely on having some really passionate, really experienced developers that knew their shit as far as like everything you need to know about Buildkite, everything you need to know about AWS and where we were deploying it, like all the little that word. They basically knew it. So it's like, as soon as we came into a problem, it was so easy to brainstorm on a whiteboard and be like, okay, we can do this, we can't do this because this team does this and this. So it was just a bunch of that going on for a few months, and we got to a solution that was really cool. And obviously, because we had the RFC process, we defined what those requirements were, and we tried to work towards them. So we set those requirements up front, and we're able to start from scratch. You obviously can't do that in all circumstances, because not every company replaces their build system completely too often. So we were lucky, and we jumped on the opportunity to help with that one. Now, because we've done all that work, we can do things like we have every single pipeline is mandated to be within source control. So that every pipeline.yaml file, now we can scan GitHub because we have that gate as well for inconsistencies within pipelines. It's very easy to automate different like regex kind of checks, secret scanning, all that kind of stuff. And we've created a few easy to use plugins that developers can use. So that AWS SMs, that's the secrets manager plugin. So literally, it's very easy to create and use secrets within your services without storing them in code. Things like that. Same with Sneak, which is what I'm going to talk about in a second, vulnerability dependency scanning. Again, it's just as simple as a plugin. So we have them actually open source on our open source repo if you want to check them out. So we have them down. We definitely haven't gone all the way. We definitely struggle with the design phase because there's multiple tools that get used, like physical boards, Jira, Trello, you name it, GitHub issues. Whatever you can think of, there's a team using that board because they're agile and whatever. So that makes it really hard for us to do like risk prioritization, like what project do we care about the most? Which features that are getting deployed do we care about the most? Because we don't care about all features. Some of them are just like a UI change or affecting a system that's so isolated with no user data, we don't really have time to care about that. We want to focus on the high-risk applications and the high-risk data assets, basically. Just because of lack of time, not because we don't care about them. So then we can start with dependency scanning, for example. Then we can start seeing high-level metrics like this, which is showing us over time And some of these can be vanity metrics, so you don't want to get too deep into these because sometimes the underlying reasons for this is not correct. So you definitely have to do some proper analysis to make sure your upper management don't take some of these metrics by surprise, or because we had that problem with vulnerability scanning using Nessus and Tenable, if you've heard of those products, where the CEO of one of our subsidiaries said, every month I must see this line of vulnerabilities going downwards, otherwise you're not doing your job correctly. So very similar to that kind of, yeah. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into that. So this is an example of the integration as well, like going to the tools that are already used by the developers. So in our case, it was GitHub. They had a GitHub integration, and now for every PR, the team decides whether they want to block or not. So it's really, we've put the control in their hands, but we still get overarching visibility of everything. So this has been working pretty well. It's still kind of new. It's been 3 or 4 months since we rolled this out, so we don't have a lot of data on how this is going yet. But this is what it looks like, very friendly UI. And the main reason I wanted to pull this up is to reiterate the developer happiness side of things, and that kind of don't shove them so many false positives. One, it's very actionable, so it tells you directly if you can open a PR automatically for this vulnerability. And 2, you can ignore it if you need to, because there's a lot of times where it's like a high risk, but it's like a denial of service, and they might not have a requirement to care about that as much as other teams. So we really want to put as much control in the hands of the developers, but then audit, so kind of the trust but verify. Nicely verify. And then again, Slack integration as well. So you can see a pattern here, right? So you're using the same tools throughout the whole cycle that the developer teams use, and giving them actionable information. So the last thing I wanted to talk about today, I'm not sure how I'm going with time. I've got a few minutes left, so I'm going to scream through this. But this is actually pretty interesting. So there's quite a few software security maturity frameworks. This one in particular, the BSIM, which we've used at Seek, has been used by quite a lot of companies in the past to assess their maturity. Again, these slides are all, I'll make them available. A lot of people talk about, let's scan for dependencies and then we're sweet, as far as that's all they care about from a security perspective. There's actually 116 different high-level activities you could be doing. So this is a really good way of breaking it down into very different areas. And most of the things that development teams will care about will be in that SDL touchpoints area, so architecture analysis, code review, security testing. But there is things like configuration management, all that kind of software environment, like hardening. Operational concerns is more in the deployment side of things. So some of the examples are like educate executives. So pretty high-level stuff around the governance and metrics. And then all the way to like operating a bug bounty program or include security awareness in tech induction, all that kind of stuff. And it also gives you data on what other firms in your vertical are doing. So this automatically tells me that black box security tools in QA processes, only 25% of all the 120 firms that were analyzed over the years have this actually implemented correctly, which either suggests it's hard to do, or it's not effective, or lots of other reasons. So you don't get a lot of that data as to why, but you can then start making your own decisions around what's best for your organization. You also get pretty funky graphs like this. This may or may not be our graph compared to Seek tech firms. So you actually go by tech vertical. So you can see in some areas we're doing a lot better, in other areas we're not doing so well. And then this graph, it tells you out of all the controls you're doing, say you work out you're doing like 30 controls, then you're going to sit in this second column over here between 16 and 30. And that's kind of where you sit on a maturity scale. And I think Google might be happy with this part of the slide. So I'm estimating that your Googles and your Facebooks of the world, because that's kind of our kind of focus area as far as where we strive to be. Maybe not so much Facebook these days. But again, I'm just guesstimating this because they don't provide that real data. But it really helps. And there's a few other competitors I had on there beforehand, which I won't have taken out on purpose. But it helps management really get an idea and paint a picture of where we sit compared to the industry, which helps influencing quite a lot in my experience. And I know we've run out of time, so you can also get things like if you're doing this every year, then you can start to see your overall positive change. There was a few reasons. It was only 2%. I was a little bit disheartened by that this year. But that's because we did a lot of M&A, so we got a lot more companies. So the scope of the assessment was a lot larger. Some areas we went down in because we started focusing on other areas that went up again. But it gives a really good picture of like, if we're scaling the business this quickly, we're going to need to put more resources or more people on security initiatives if we actually want to make a decent change. So you start having those kind of conversations with management as well. And I talk about that quite extensively in this blog post as well. And that is it. Thank you.